For Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's debate concerns extending the pause for assisted death for people with mental illness and disabilities as the sole underlying condition. The Liberals' original bill last year included this expansion. However, public and professional backlash towards their measures caused them to hold back for 1 year. And this deadline is fast approaching. The 1-year extension expires in March, at which time MAiD will be accessible to very vulnerable people unless there is a change in legislation. This expansion is terrible legislation for Canadians, but it's on par for the Liberal NDP government. As someone who has taught Canadian history, I'm sorry to say, but I cannot think of a worse government in Canadian history. Why does this Liberal government pursue such harmful policies across the board? Their environmental plan is a war against our natural resource sector, which is the foundation of Canadians' wealth and prosperity, and provides the finances for healthcare and infrastructure and services important to Canadians. Their catch and release policies has unleashed crime and chaos in our cities. Their soft on drug approach has resulted in 40,000 overdose deaths. Record numbers died last year in BC. Some of them I know. However, today we are debating Canada's MAiD regime under the Liberals and NDP. 4.1% of all deaths in Canada in 2022 were people that died from MAiD. Second only to the Netherlands, who has implemented it in 2002. Euthanasia became legal in Canada in 2016, and you compare it, the numbers of Canadians that die even in 2022, that's the last statistics I'm aware of, compare the figures there, which was 13,241 people who died from MAiD, with California, a population of pretty much the same as Canada, 40 million, and implemented MAiD in 2016 also, and they had 853 deaths. It's quite the discrepancy. Is it because that subtly the government is promoting it, and maybe not so subtly? I think of Canadian Forces veteran Christine Gautier, a 5-time world champion at the Paralympics, who testified that the Department of Veterans Affairs, that when she requested help from the department, she was offered MAiD. They wrote a letter to her saying that if she was so desperate for help, that they could offer her MAiD. I think it's disgraceful, incomprehensible. 6 other veterans that we're aware of were also offered medical assisted death. That's the ones we know of. It's easier in Canada to get MAiD than it is to get palliative care. That's disgraceful. It's easier to get MAiD in Canada, and the wait time is less, than to get psychiatric help, and that's disgraceful. It's easier to get MAiD than to get supports. Andrew Robbins from Hamilton told the Globe and Mail that he was seeking medically assisted death to escape the cycle of poverty and health problems. Under this NDP liberal government, everything is getting more expensive. People are struggling to pay the rent, pay gas, pay for groceries. He stated, "I know one thing, I would be better dead than on the streets. My wife would be better also." And that's a shame. The bill before us delays the implementation of MAiD being extended to people with mental illness and those with disabilities who are not facing imminent death. Over 200 organizations representing persons with disabilities across Canada actively opposed and urged the government to appeal this decision. Not a single national disabilities rights organization expressed support for the repeal of RFND, which is reasonably foreseeable natural death. They said it stigmatizes MAiD for people with disabilities and dehumanizes persons with disabilities and the international human rights obligations. United Nations representatives also agree. This legislation is so contrary to what our country has stood for. I think of BC native Rick Hansen, paraplegic, who did the Man in Motion World Tour on a wheelchair. His message is that you can do it. You can be productive in spite of your disabilities. You can enjoy a full life despite these challenges. Terry Fox, also from British Columbia, lost his leg to cancer, decided to run across Canada for cancer research. He had to stop in Thunder Bay because the cancer had returned, but still the Terry Fox run continues, raising hundreds of millions of dollars, and he is a national hero. He's an inspiration not to give up. Then there's Nicholas James Vucevic, mispronouncing his last name. He's not a Canadian, but he was born with a rare disease without arms and legs, and only a 6-inch foot coming out of his torso. He founded an organization called Life Without Limbs. He's spoken to millions of people, very inspirational, saying no matter what your circumstances, we have something to give and to live for in helping others. This is the message that we should be promoting, especially to people who become disabled. I'm disturbed that the Liberals merely want to just postpone this legislation, which opens wide the door for people still struggling with mental illnesses to access medically assisted death. The chairs of all of Canada's 17 schools, so their psychiatric departments, called on the Liberals to hold off. They said it's extremely difficult to predict whether a person will get better or will recover, as my colleagues even across the side has mentioned, and that clinicians get it wrong 50% of the time. As my colleague from St. Albert said, it's like flipping a coin with people's lives. Suicidal thoughts are often symptoms of mental disorders, and it's hard to distinguish between the two. People can get better with supports, and a great many do. In the early 1980s, I went through a clinical depression. It was a very dark and painful time, and suicidal thoughts bombarded me. I had medical care, and I had friends with me, and I totally recovered. And it's only now a distant memory, and all the pain and all the despair and all the darkness is now faded. And there is hope. Most people with opioid addictions also struggle with mental illness. Is this a direction that the government is prepared to take us? It seems sinister. Liberals and NDP give addicts, they provide addicts free hard drugs. And there's a high likelihood that this will kill them sooner or later, as we're seeing by statistics. But if they don't like their state of life as an addict, in 3 years, if we have a Liberal government, state-sanctioned suicide could be available to them. Conservatives believe in supporting the most vulnerable. We believe in treatment and recovery and not safe injection sites. We believe in palliative care at the end of life and supports for our most vulnerable. We initiated, the member, I believe, from Prince George, the 811 suicide prevention line. And finally, Conservatives believe that this bill expanding to people, MAiD to people with disabilities, needs to be struck down because it could be brought back in 3 years. Thank you very much.
I think we have a point of order from the honourable member for Caribou, Prince George.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to correct my honourable colleague. I know in his zest for this intervention, he misread the number. It is not 811, it's 988.
I think that was a good clarification. Not a point of order, but a good clarification.
This is the member.
Question, thank you. Questions and comments, question or commentaire. The honourable member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Speaker, it wasn't that long ago where "Made in Canada" was a phrase we were proud of. Now, we do have teenagers, sometimes for the very first time in their lives, they're encountering adversity, and it's a psychological crisis to them, and they react in such a way that they're actually trying to commit suicide. And it's often said that an attempt at suicide is a cry for help. They end up in the hospital for a time. We've seen with veterans how some of them who seem to be near the end of life have been encouraged to use MAiD. Is there anything in this legislation that would explicitly prevent medical workers from suggesting MAiD to the people who attempt suicide but thankfully are not deceased as a consequence of it?
Honourable member for Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge.
It's quite unfortunate, but even under the old regime, that there were many people, and I'm aware of people that were not facing imminent death that were still received it. So I believe the member from Thunder Bay, the Liberal member, actually he talked about some of the zealous doctors that prescribe it, and so I'm aware of that this has happened. So there is nothing that I'm aware of, and there is, mentioning the member talked about youth. I know family members that have gone through drug issues, mental health issues, and have come out on the other side, and now are supporting people in a similar situation.
Comments, question or commentaire. The honourable member for Esquimalt-Saanich-Sooke.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have the same question through this whole debate today, and that is, as I've said before, we all know that access to mental health supports varies by your residence, by your income, by your ethnicity, and so people have trouble accessing mental health services. So my question to the member is, would he support making mental health services fully part of the Canada Health Act so we can equalize access to mental health services in this country?
For Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge.
No, we do not have the supports we need for people with mental health challenges. And you mentioned about ethnicities. I'm Indigenous, I'm Métis, and I know that a lot of the Indigenous First Nations, Métis groups are very concerned because the number of suicide attempts among adults is at least double the rest of Canada's population, and among youth it's 6 times. So it's very vulnerable, and I think that it's a concern, especially for Indigenous Canadians.
Comments, question, commentaire. The honourable member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question to my colleague is, this amendment was brought in by the Senate the other place in the first place. It wasn't in the original legislation. It came back here, and the Liberals decided it was a good idea, and it got put through the House without any time limit. It was supposed to be law, and then they extended it for a year. Now they're trying to extend it for 3 years, and they're relying on the same people who brought in this idea of MAiD for mental illness to postpone it for 3 years. Does the member think that this is going to be an easy ride through the Senate? Or are those senators who brought this in the first place going to give it a hard ride?
The honourable member for Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge.
That's a real concern, especially we do have a deadline in March, so to get it passed here and then in through the Senate.